Hello, you're welcome to AJ Tutorials. Today we'll be learning about the generation of computers, in which we'll study about the process of advancement and improvements in computers. Let's quickly start. So basically there are 5 generation of computers, and they are: we have in the first generation computers, second generation computers, third generation computers, fourth generation computers, and the fifth generation computers. So in all, we're having 5 generations. Let's quickly start the first generation. So with the first generation computers, it started around 1940 and ended up around 1959. These computers used vacuum tubes as a main component and magnetic data drums for memory. So during the first generation, vacuum tubes were being used, and let us look at the picture of the vacuum tube. As we see over there, it's big. That means the computer itself around that time is going to be big. Let's also look at the magnetic data drum, which was acting as the memory. With this big device being used in the computer, that means the computer is going to be very huge. And that time, computers almost can occupy an entire room. The price too was costly. Due to this, due to the size of the computer is around that time, they can also, and the things or the devices being used, they help or they allow the computer to use a lot of electricity and also generated a lot of heat. The language that was being used around that time was a machine language. And talking about machine language, that's binary code, which is zeros and ones. During the first generation, computers that were being invented were limited to solving one problem at a time, because that was the first invention of computers, and therefore they need to sit down and know how machine is going to solve a problem, a human problem. Input was done using a punch card and a paper tape. Around that time too, they were not using keyboard as we have now, normal keyboard. They were using a punch card. So the punch card was acting as the input device, as the keyboard. We also have a paper tape, which was also in the form of a string of paper, that is a strip of paper, which there is going to be an inscription of holes on it, and each hole or without a hole gives a reading. Output from these computers came out in the printout format. That's, as they were not having a keyboard, they were also not having a monitor for the display. They were having a printout format. That's a printer which is going to print out the information. Two notable machines around the time were UNIVAC and ENIAC. That means they were not the only machines invented around that time, but they are the two notable ones. The UNIVAC, as we talk about, it was the first commercial computer which was purchased in 1951 by the US government. That's the US Census Bureau. So with the US Census Bureau, this happened when the US government decided to construct or populate a census. Normally around that time they use almost about 8 years to populate census. So they realized, no, why don't we seek the aid of technologists or scientists for them to help us populate our census in the shortest possible time. Then they came up with the UNIVAC to help them with their aid. Now let's look at some examples of the first generation computers. We have an ENIAC, electronic, that will stand for electronic numerical integrator and computer. Let's look at a picture over there. As we said earlier, we said it can occupy an entire room, so the picture is telling us something. As we see in each image, we can realize that the computer, the machine being used, has almost occupied the room. Let's look at the next example, which is EDVAC, which stands for Electronic Discrete Variable Automatic Computer, which is also as big as the first example. The next one, which is UNIVAC, which was being used by the US government for the census. And UNIVAC also stands for Universal Automatic Computer. The next, which is IBM 701. And IBM basically stands for International Business Machines. And this is the picture of IBM 701. The next, which is another IBM 650. You already know the full name of IBM. Let's look at the picture itself. So you see there is a slight difference in the first IBM, that's IBM 701 and IBM 750. Let's quickly move on to the second generation. The second generation started around 1959. That's around immediately at the end of the first generation, and it ended up around 1963. Therefore, the main component used during the second generation was transistors. The vacuum tubes that were used in the first generation were rather replaced by transistors during the second generation. Transistor, as we speak, is over there. So the picture you see over there is a transistor. We've been seeing them nowadays in most of our devices or our consoles. So that's a transistor. They came to replace vacuum tubes. They were invented by three gentlemen called William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brattain. The place where they invented it was at the Bell Laboratories in the US in 1951. So they invented the transistors at Bell Laboratories. With the invention of transistors, this made computers smaller, because as compared to the vacuum tube, which was very big, now transistor, as you see over here, is small in size. So the computers around this time is going to be reduced, that the size is going to be reduced, and then the speed too will increase, the price can also decrease, and the usage of electricity is also going to reduce. Yes, still they relies on the punch card for input and then print out for output as the first generation, but there was a change in language. The language changed from machine language to symbolic language, which is assembly, meaning that programmers can now create instruction in words, because unlike the machine language whereby you'll be using binary code, which is zeros and ones, for assembly you'll be using the binary code associated by the some string of letters or alphabets. Aside that, transistor computers were the first computers to store information into their memory, which is they moved from magnetic data RAM to magnetic core memory. So the memory for the second generation computers was magnetic core memory. Especially these type of computers were developed for atomic energy industries. Let's look at some of the examples of second generation computers. So we have a UNIVAC 1. As we see there, we've realized that the picture of this computer, as compared to the first generation, there's a reduction in size. And also IBM 620, followed by IBM 7094. So we've realized that if we are to compare the first generation and second generation, there has been reduction in size. Let's quickly move on to the third generation computers. With the third generation computers, the main component there was the integrated circuits, and it started around in 1963 and ended up around 1971. Transistors were now smaller and put on silicon chips called integrated circuits, as now we used to call them IC. So IC has also been seen in the numerous consoles nowadays. This led to the increase in speed and efficiency of computers with the introduction of IC. These were the first computers where users interacted with keyboard and monitor. This is also a key point for the third generation, that there was an increase in technology and advancement, because during the first and second generation they were still relying on punch card and also printouts for their display. Therefore, with the third generation, keyboard was being introduced and a monitor too was introduced. So this will bring up the development or invention of personal computer. Now, as we're talking about IC, integrated circuits, which has been displayed over there, so that's a picture or an image of an integrated circuit IC. And the personal computer that was being invented during the third generation is also seen over there. So that means there was an advancement. Let's quickly move on to the fourth generation computers. With the fourth generation computers, it started around 1972 and ended up around 2010. That's 2010. The main components around the fourth generation computers, or the main components used for the fourth generation computers, were the microprocessors. And within this generation, there were a lot of inventions. Thus, in 1971, Intel Corporation, that's the world's largest microchip, manufactured Intel 4004. That's a microprocessor. So the Intel Corporation around that time invented or developed the Intel 4004, which was the first microprocessor. And in 1981, IBM was designed for home use, unlike the previous generations. And in 1984, Macintosh operating system also introduced the Apple computer. So we realized that during the fourth generation, there was also an advancement in technology. Now, the microprocessor we talk about is over there. That's a picture of the microprocessor. Now, let's look at a group of microprocessors. Yeah. So we are having Core 2 Duo, Intel Core 2 Duo, we have an AMD, we also have Intel Core i7, and so on. Another advancement was the introduction of graphic user interface. That's whereby the user is going to have an interaction with the computer itself, even if the user himself, him or herself, is having a basic knowledge about computation or about computing. Laptops and handheld devices were also introduced around this generation. This example of the computers that were being used during the fourth generation, and on the other hand too, we have the same type of computer that were being used around the fourth generation. We have in the computer mouse, the monitor system, and then the keyboard. The same thing applies here. The monitor system and the keyboard also over there. Now let's move on to the last generation, which is the fifth generation computers. The main component also over here, or the main theme for the fifth generation computers, is the introduction of artificial intelligence, that's in short AI, which started around 2010, that's 2010, and then it is still in circulation. We are still in the fifth generation, moving on onwards, sometimes even C seventh year still is part of their fifth generation because it is an artificial intelligence, so they all fall under the fifth generation. So any advancement now that's going on is all part of the fifth generation. Let's have a little talk about the artificial intelligence. With artificial intelligence is a theory and development of computer system being able to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence, such as visual perception, speech recognition, decision making, and translating between languages. As it stands now, there are some companies, there are some restaurants, and so on that do not even employ humans to work. They have already developed, or they are now using machines at the field where human beings are going to work. Now we have in some restaurants, they are having robot that or a machine that can wash the bowl instantly, then a human being will rather distribute it. The time will come that when we go to a restaurant, you will never see a human being. All that will be seen is robots. The same thing with translation. We can communicate easily with anyone at all from any language, from any country speaking any language, by using a typical example, which is Google Translator, which will translate the language directly to the one that you wish or the one that you understand. Therefore, with the introduction of artificial intelligence, it is the way to make computers, machines, and robots think, reason, and behave like human beings. So, this is what is going on this century or this era now. Now, a time will come, we are not going to even see people being employed as soldiers or police. I mean, the security agencies. They are going to just employ in, or they are going to be using artificial intelligence, especially robots. As we are having smartwatches being introduced now, it's part of artificial intelligence. As typically, let's look at some of the examples of artificial intelligence. Otherwise, you're not going to finish. So we are having smartphone, we are having tablets, laptops, and so on. So let's look at the images of such artificial intelligence. We have a robot over here. Yeah, as human beings, we used to stand there and think, look at what the robot there over is doing. A time will come, a robot is going to think and even dream. Yeah, but okay, only God knows the best. Now, let's move on. We also have another one, a robot interacting with a human being as if they are siblings. Oh, or they are friends. Yeah. On the other hand, we also have some bunch of artificial intelligence that we have in a monitor, a keyboard, mouse, and some consoles over there. I realized when I went to the market to purchase a device that's a console. When I went there, I was even surprised that to see a monitor with a system with all in one. At the same time, the monitor was also what? Touch. That you can touch it. So without the usage of a mouse or a keyboard, you can use it at home. System unit is included. That's all in one. It's part of the artificial intelligence. We also have another examples over here. That's laptop. We have a smartphone and then desktop computer. Aside that, we also have some bunch of consoles. Okay. Now, to conclude it, let's summarize everything. That's to end our lesson. With the generation of computers, we said we are having 5 generations, and the picture over here depicts the first generation, which is very big and can even occupy an entire room. Generate a lot of heat. It was also expensive. Second generation, which came to reduce the burden or the disadvantages of the first generation. And that's the second generation. We also have the third generation, which also came to reduce also the disadvantages or the burden or the challenges being encountered during the second generation. That's computers were being made small, the prices reduced, the speed also increased. Fourth generation computers also came to reduce the challenges for the third generation. Um, that the speed increase, the price reduce. Uh, okay, let's move on to the fifth generation. That the AI, the artificial intelligence era, the era that we are in now. So computers were also made smaller into different shapes and sizes, and even with the introduction of robots and other consoles. Now, I wish you all the best. See you next time.